Deep underground cemeteries. The city of Jerusalem is plagued by a chronic shortage of burial space for the dead. It makes sense, considering the massive number of people who have been laid to rest in the holy city over the last several thousand years. To combat the problem, workers dug a series of tunnels beneath Jerusalem's main cemetery back in 2017. These spaces will accommodate as many as 22,000 graves in the coming years. Authorities resorted to this unique solution because, in the words of Rolls-Royce Tunneling Company Chief Executive Ari Glazer, there simply isn't enough land at ground level for the number of burials that are expected to take place in the city in coming years. The concept of vertical cemeteries is catching on globally, and Israel is at the forefront of the movement. It's becoming increasingly popular in places with dominant religions that forbid cremation. By taking burials underground, Jerusalem actually revived an ancient custom that was common between 1600 and 2000 years ago. In fact, this is what helped the idea gain approval from Israel's chief rabbi. It's like going back thousands of years and placing the dead in niches carved out of the rock. The main difference is that the new subterranean cemetery is strikingly modern, with LED lighting and an elevator that transports visitors 50 meters down to the site. Wari trophy skulls. The Wari Empire flourished long ago between 600 and 1000 AD in the Peruvian Andes. It was one of the New World's first politically centralized cultures that used its military and economic power to vastly expand its territory. A recent study found that the Wari dominated the landscape through sheer violence. Author Tiffany Tong wrote that political and military elites encouraged brutal acts like abducting members of foreign settlements. They savagely sacrificed and dismembered adult men and children and turned their heads into trophies. The victims were decapitated, then their skulls were skinned and pierced for public display. I mean, would you pick a fight with someone that carries around a spear with human heads on it? 12 of these so-called trophy heads were unearthed at the Urraca archaeological site in southwestern Peru. The images are shocking, with one of them showing a skull that was pierced through the top and had a rope strung through it. The team also found the skull of a pampas cat that had received the same treatment, showing that cats were also used in the culture's mortuary rituals. All of the skulls bear signs of trauma near the time of death. This indicates that the deceased were warriors whose enemies took their heads as battle souvenirs. Despite its significant wealth and military power, the Wari civilization began to deteriorate around 800 AD. Its population declined dramatically, and by 1100 AD, the culture collapsed entirely. The reasons behind the Wari's downfall are unknown, but experts suspect that environmental changes like drought and political infighting may have been factors. Ancient preserved brain. In 2008, archaeologists unearthed a human brain at an Iron Age site in York, England. Dating back some 2,600 years to the 6th century BC, it's the oldest preserved human brain ever found. Known as the Heslington brain, the organ was discovered inside of a skull that was found face down in a pit of wet clay. Project officer Rachel Cubbett told BBC that she noticed a yellow spongy material while peering through the hole at the base of the skull, adding it was unlike anything I had seen before. The brain belonged to a man who died between the ages of 26 and 45. Someone removed his head from his body using a small, sharp knife and probably buried it in the oxygen-free clay shortly after. This might help to explain why it was found in such good condition. The man's flesh, skin, and hair decomposed over time, yet his brain somehow stayed remarkably well preserved. Last year, a study found that certain types of brain filaments may have also helped to keep the Heslington brain intact, and that the man may have suffered from a disease that somehow affected its preservation. Western Xia Imperial tombs. The Xia dynasty is considered the first dynasty of China, and the lines between history and myth are quite blurred. There isn't much archaeological evidence going back to the very beginning, but what researchers have found are some very impressive imperial tombs. Established in what is now northwestern China, the Western Xia dynasty existed from 1038 to 1227 AD. Before the Western was just the Xia, with historical records talking about a giant flood that destroyed the area around 1920 BC. The first legendary emperor struggled to control the flooding, and the one who could help control the water became the next emperor. What little is known about the empire's founders is based on limited excavations that have been carried out at its imperial burial site. Situated at the foot of the Helan Mountains in the Gobi Desert, the Western Xia mausoleums make up a massive burial complex of the Western Xia dynasty. Only one mausoleum has been excavated to date and has been connected with the kingdom's first emperor, Jingzong. Occupying an area of some 50 square kilometers, the Western Xia Imperial tombs include 9 imperial mausoleums, 254 smaller tombs, a large building complex, and more than 10 brick and tile kiln sites. This place was left behind by the Tangut civilization, which is now long gone. This site went undiscovered by several early 20th century explorers before finally catching the attention of an archaeologist who captured it in an aerial photograph during the 1930s. The Western Xia dynasty came to an end when the Mongols invaded and destroyed it during the 13th century. Its history was unfortunately obscured by the destruction of the culture's architecture and written records. Most of what experts know was learned relatively recently, during the 20th century. Bronze Age burial. While digging a pond in 2018, workers at the Tetney Golf Club in Lincolnshire, England, stumbled upon an ancient wooden coffin. The waterlogged burial contained the remains of a man holding an axe. The discovery shocked the club's owner, Mark Caswell, who told the press that his family had farmed the land for years and never encountered anything like it. Experts were called to the scene, where they found the coffin in pieces and at risk of further falling apart in the summer heat. To prevent further damage, they rushed to excavate and preserve it. Made from a hollowed-out tree, the 10-foot-long casket represented what archaeologists called an unusual form of burial that was practiced briefly around 4,000 years ago during the Bronze Age. The man inside died during his late 30s or early 40s. He was around 5 foot 9 inches tall, which was unusually tall for the time, and his bones bore signs of osteoarthritis, which likely resulted from hard work rather than old age. A lot of effort was put into his burial, indicating that he was a high-ranking member of his community. Before the team could preserve the coffin or the perfectly preserved axe found inside it, they had to thoroughly research the materials to prevent damaging them. It took 3 years to treat the artifacts and reassemble the coffin, which was like putting together a big jigsaw puzzle, in the words of Ian Panter, who heads the York Archaeological Trust. It was recently announced that the preservation work is expected to take 2 more years. When it's finished, the artifacts will go on display at the Lincoln Collection Museum. Golden Sun Bowl. When archaeologist Michael Sipp was tasked with leading routine excavations at a construction site outside Vienna in Austria, he didn't plan on finding anything too exciting. Much to his surprise, the team unearthed a 3,000-year-old golden bowl decorated with a sun relief. At first glance, the Ebreichsdorf bowl, as it's come to be called, doesn't seem like a big deal. Measuring just 8 inches in diameter, the artifact is actually rather small. It's made from a thin metal consisting of 90% gold, 5% silver, and 5% copper. Inside the bowl, the team found 2 gold bracelets, some gold wire, and fragments of decomposed cloth or leather. Sipp told the Polish press agency that the deteriorating pieces were probably once part of a decorative scarf that was used during religious ceremonies. Sipp described the fascinating find as the discovery of a lifetime. Similar bowls have been found elsewhere, including Spain, France, Germany, Scandinavia, and Switzerland. But this is the first bowl of its type ever found in Austria, and the second of its kind discovered east of the Alpine line, according to Sipp. These vessels trace back to the ancient urnfield culture, which began spreading throughout Europe as far back as the 12th century BC. They are named for their tradition of burying urns filled with cremated remains in fields. The team found over 500 artifacts total at the site, including bronze items and clay pottery. The bowl became the property of the Austrian government to ensure that members of the public will get an opportunity to see it on display, and that the artifact won't become lost in a private collection. Corpse mix-up. A North Carolina family recently received a truly unpleasant surprise at their matriarch's funeral when they discovered the wrong person in her casket. Sisters Jennifer Taylor and Janetta Archer approached their mother Mary's coffin at a viewing, only to find someone else in it wearing her clothes. Jennifer told the local news station that the pair knew something was off the moment they looked into the casket. Mary's outfit was way too big on the deceased individual, and the person looked nothing like Jennifer and Danetta's mom. They took it up with the funeral home staff, whom they claim initially denied the mix-up. The sisters persuaded an employee to double-check, and when they went into the embalming room, they found their mother's body. Although the business fixed their mistake and the service proceeded, Jennifer and Danetta were left feeling like the matter was never properly resolved. They also claimed that the funeral home failed to apologize to the family for the horrible mix-up. Speaking to the local news station, the lead embalmer did finally admit to the mistake and issued an apology to Mary's family. He said that this was the first time something like this had happened in over 40 years in business, and claimed that he tried to call Jennifer and Danetta to explain. The sisters said that they never received those calls, leaving them with unanswered questions about how the mix-up happened and what the company plans to do to avoid making the same mistake in the future. Chinchorro mummies. Did you know that the world's oldest mummies aren't actually from Egypt? The Chinchorro culture developed their preservation techniques around 5000 BC, roughly 2,000 years before the ancient Egyptians. Most people don't know about the Chinchorro mummies, even though they were first discovered a century ago. But it took decades to figure out their age. Located in the Atacama Desert in the part of Chile that borders with Peru, the Chinchorro culture emerged around 7000 BC. Locals have often come across these mummies when they were building or their dogs would pull one out, but no one really knew how significant these finds were. These prehistoric hunter-gatherers were the first people to artificially mummify their dead. At first, only babies and those born premature were preserved, perhaps due to the high infant mortality rate at the time. The practice eventually spread to adults. There were 5 different types of mummies in the Chinchorro culture, which spanned over 4,000 years. The 2 most common types are known as black and red mummies. Black mummies were made by taking a person's body apart and reassembling it, while red mummies were prepared by removing the internal organs through small incisions and letting the body dry out. The dead were then stuffed with twigs and reeds and wore wigs and clay masks. According to the BBC, they would also attach thick black hair onto the mummy's head and cover its face with clay and the mask with openings for the eyes and mouth. They would then paint the bodies using natural pigments from things like ochre, minerals, and iron oxide. Their settlements in Chile's Arica and Parinacota region were declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site this year. Experts are hoping this newfound status will help acquire the funds necessary to preserve the mummies, which are increasingly under the threat of being destroyed by time and the elements. The Holy Right Hand. Stephen I, also known as King Saint Stephen, was Hungary's first king. He was canonized in 1083 by Pope Gregory VII. When his remains were exhumed from his grave, his right fist remained perfectly preserved, even though Stephen had died decades earlier. It was severed from his body and preserved as a religious relic, known as the Holy Right Hand. The following year, a cleric named Mercurius stole Stephen's fist. At the time, stealing relics was so common that the practice even had a name, furta sacra. The stolen hand was soon recovered and spent several centuries at a monastic house. It moved around quite a bit after that, before ultimately ending up in the Hungarian city whose name I can't pronounce, 1420. The Ottomans occupied Hungary's central territories in the mid-16th century. During that time, the Holy Right Hand was kept in Croatia, Bosnia, and Vienna in Austria. It finally returned to Hungary in 1771, and in 1950 it ended up at its current home in St. Stephen's Basilica. Every year on August 20th, known as St. Stephen's Day or State Foundation Day, the Holy Right Hand is carried in a parade through the streets of Budapest. This tradition started in 1938, but was forbidden by the communist government in 1950. It resumed in 1988 when Hungary's communist regime fell. Visitors can view the Holy Right Hand by inserting a coin into a slot, which will light up the spooky display for about 1 minute. Buried game pieces. While excavating an ancient building at the Tel Kadesh site in Israel in 2008, archaeologists found a puzzling collection of personal belongings. It was a group of artifacts that were buried beneath a paving stone during the 2nd century BC. The artifacts included a terracotta figurine of the god Eros, also known under the Roman name as Cupid, a bone hairpin, 2 metal writing instruments, and 23 glass game pieces. Most of the items were of high-quality craftsmanship, They were also very well preserved, indicating that they were buried deliberately and carefully. But why? Archaeologists were especially interested in the glass game pieces. It's unusual to find so many game pieces together, save for the rare exception of a child's grave. There were 18 round pieces used to play mancala, and 5 knucklebone pieces all placed together. Archaeologist Adi Ehrlich went on a quest for more answers, and she found a lead in an ancient text. It told the story of a young woman named Hippa, who deposited her treasured game pieces into the ground as an offering to the god Artemis around the time of her wedding. While the tale's exact author is unknown, his name was Antipater, and someone of that name actually lived in the nearby city of Sidon during the late 2nd century BC. Ehrlich's findings present the very realistic possibility that the Tel Kadesh hoard belonged to Hippa. Giant skeleton. In 2017, archaeologists in southeastern China's Shandong province unearthed the 5,000-year-old skeletons of several so-called giants. The individuals were found among over 200 graves in the Neolithic village of Jiaojia. One male was 6 feet 3 inches tall, which may not seem that tall by today's standards, but 5,000 years ago, they would have been literal giants, kind of like the guy I just told you about with the axe. Others measured 5 feet 11 inches. Their heights were calculated based on their bones alone, meaning they were probably slightly taller in flesh and blood. Even today they would be tall, but they lived when people were much shorter on average, making them extraordinarily tall for their time. For example, in 2015, the typical 18-year-old male in the region was 5 feet 9 inches tall, and the national average was 5 feet 8 inches tall, despite people having better access to nutrition nowadays. Researchers believe that the ancient people were from the Longshan culture, which was known to eat a robust diet. The increased availability of food that came with the transition to agriculture changed their physique, and the giant men were buried in larger graves, indicating that they were of high-ranking status in their society, which would have given them access to the best foods available at the time. This place must have been amazing back in the day. Jiaojia's houses had separate bedrooms and kitchens, which are yet another testament to the comfortable lifestyle its residents enjoyed. The village was only partially excavated when the discovery was announced, meaning that there may be more surprising discoveries in store. Planet Venus may have been livable. Venus is hellish today, with a bone-dry surface and an atmosphere that's hot enough to melt lead, according to Life Science. But it may not have always been like this. In recent years, experts have increasingly come to consider the possibility that the planet Venus was once able to support life. At one time, the second planet from the Sun may have been home to vast oceans and a hospitable climate that persisted for billions of years. Some scientists even believe that it's possible for certain life forms to still exist in the clouds that sit 30 miles above the surface, because the temperatures and pressures are similar to those at sea level on Earth. A new study, however, challenges the idea that life does or ever could have existed on Venus. Researchers re-examined a previous model, which suggested that the planet went through a cooling period that allowed it to host liquid water. The theoretical model claims that moisture was present thanks to clouds, which bounced condensation back to the planet's surface. At the time, the sun was still young and much fainter than it is today, and Venus had yet to become the blazing hot, barren rock it is now. As part of the recent study, scientists created a new climate model of ancient Venus, and it yielded much different results. The team found that clouds were likely limited to the side of the planet facing away from the sun, known as the night side, and they were not at all conducive to life. The clouds did not bounce light away and may have even caused a greenhouse effect by trapping heat. Simply put, in the words of astronomers James Casting and Chester Harmon, who addressed the topic in the journal Nature, Venus was always a hellhole, an ancient murder cover-up. Around 1,300 years ago, a man was murdered and then buried at Xi'anzi Cemetery, an ancient burial ground in north-central China. A recent study has finally pieced together the events leading up to his death. Gas pipeline workers discovered the graveyard in 2002, and it was excavated in 2009 and 2011. In their report, archaeologists reported finding 4 people: a man, a woman, a child, and the victim that was murdered, who was buried separately from everyone else. Xinyazi Cemetery was heavily looted in the past, indicating that the family buried there was very wealthy. according to the lead study author Wang Qian. The murder victim's body was found in a shaft that grave robbers had used to access the tombs, and tests showed that he died 700 years after the family that was buried nearby, meaning that the victim had zero relation to the family. Researchers initially theorized that he was a grave robber who somehow died while looting the site, either by an accident or at someone else's hands. His skeleton bears over a dozen V-shaped stab marks, showing that he indeed met a violent end. Someone had brutally plunged a sharp object into the man's face, the back of his head, his ribs, and his arms and legs. He had clearly been attacked, but by who? That's the real mystery. The recent study determined that the shaft had been out of use for centuries before the victim either fell or was thrown into the shaft, proving that he was actually not a grave robber at all. Researchers now believe that he was a homicide victim, and that his killer had most likely tossed him into the shaft to hide the body and avoid the death penalty punishment that came with murder charges under the Tang dynasty. And it worked. The victim vanished and remained undiscovered until recent decades, meaning someone, long ago, got away with murder. Oldest ghost drawing. The world's oldest ghost depiction was recently discovered in the British Museum's vaults on an ancient Babylonian clay tablet dating back 3,500 years. The British Museum acquired the artifact during the 19th century. Dr. Irving Finkel, curator of the museum's Middle Eastern department, spotted the long-overlooked object while studying ghost-related tablets. At least half of the tablet is missing, and what's left of it is small enough to fit in the palm of a person's hand. It features a barely visible carving of a woman pulling a grumpy-looking bearded man into the underworld by a rope. The text is written in cuneiform, an ancient writing system that originated in the Middle East. It describes a ritual spell for getting a pesky male ghost to go away. Finkel told Life Science that he believes the ritual detailed on the tablet would have been used to exorcise a ghost that refused to leave a household and had taken its antics beyond harmless fun and games. Tower of Babel tablet. According to one of the Bible's origin myths, following the Great Flood, a group of people established a city in Babylon and settled here. They decided to build a tower extending to heaven to make a name for themselves, known as the Tower of Babel. At the time, there was a single language spoken by all people, but God saw this tower and thought, if my people can build this magnificent structure with one language, imagine what they could do with more. And so he scrambled their speech and made them speak many languages. The story is often seen as a way to explain why people speak different languages. Whether or not the Tower of Babel actually existed is a hotly debated topic amongst scholars. Dr. Andrew George, a professor of Babylonia at the University of London, claims that he has found solid evidence proving the tower's existence. He discovered an ancient baked tablet in the city of Babylon, showing King Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled Babylon 2,500 years ago, next to a 7-story ziggurat, or a stepped pyramid or tower. This very real building may have inspired the story in the Bible, because at the time, the structure would have been the most impressive thing built for miles and miles around. It's one of only 4 known depictions of the king ever found. Additionally, the tablet contains an account of the tower's construction. Discovered over a century ago, roughly 80 miles south of modern-day Baghdad among the ruins of Babylon, it bears evidence of what some researchers believe is the Tower of Babel. Dr. George says that the relief describes recruiting workers from several different regions, including the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. Not all experts agree with Dr. George's analysis. Other researchers pointed out that Nebuchadnezzar II's reign doesn't coincide with the Bible's timeline, which holds that the Tower of Babel was built during the 3rd millennium BC, long before the king's rule. Therefore, if the Bible is accurate, then the carving can't possibly depict the Tower of Babel. Lost ghost ships. 24 World War II-era ghost ships recently surfaced in the Pacific Ocean following seismic activity from an underwater volcano off the Japanese coast. Located 800 miles southwest of Tokyo, Fukutoku Okanoba has been erupting since August, causing the seabed to rise around the island of Iwo Jima. Surprisingly, it has also brought up the ships. Iwo Jima is part of the Bonin Islands, which are prone to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The ships that recently appeared near the shoreline are the remains of Japanese transport vessels that U.S. forces sank after the Battle of Iwo Jima in 1945. Iwo Jima was a major World War II battle. For 36 days, 70,000 U.S. Marines fought against a force of around 20,000 Japanese soldiers. It was one of World War II's bloodiest battles, killing all but 216 Japanese troops who were taken prisoner. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed, and another 20,000 were wounded. There was no port at Iwo Jima, so the Marines scuttled the ships parallel to the island's shoreline to create a breakwater. Now that they've resurfaced, they'll probably remain in place for a while. Iwo Jima is littered with unexploded bombs and grenades, so nobody lives there and people rarely visit. For safety's sake, the Japanese government will probably decide to leave the ships in place rather than attempt to remove or scrap them. A parasite within a parasite. In 1991, an ecologist named Ilkka Hanski introduced a butterfly called the Glanville fritillary to the remote Finnish island of Sottunga. His plan was to study how the isolated population could survive in the harsh habitat. Hanski got more than he bargained for when he unintentionally released a trio of parasites. One of the parasites lives within some of the butterflies, and the other two live inside of that parasite. It's essentially a Russian doll of parasites. One of the parasites, Hypocytor horticola, are wasp larvae that are injected into Glanville fritillary caterpillars from the outside. They emerge from their host's abdomen and proceed to spin a cocoon around the dead caterpillar. The other two parasites nest inside the wasp larva. One is a type of wasp called a hyperparasitoid, and the other is a bacteria. After the wasp larva kills its caterpillar host, the hyperparasitoid kills the wasp larva. Days later, the eggs hatch, and the larvae eat the dead caterpillar. Shockingly, the Glanville butterfly has survived numerous near-extinction events on the island. Their resilience can be attributed to Hanski's decision to introduce a genetically diverse population when he began his experiment 30 years ago. But the parasites are also thriving. Unlike the Glanville butterfly, their populations are not limited to Sottunga. These skilled flyers have spread elsewhere throughout the Åland archipelago, including to other Glanville populations that are separate from the Sottunga butterflies. They've even reached previously uninhabited islands. Experts use the accidental introduction of parasites as a fascinating case study, but have pointed out a major lesson learned from it, that scientists need to carefully consider the possible implications of introducing a species to a new habitat, including other creatures it may bring with it. Airbnb is watching you. While staying at an Airbnb recently, a TikToker named Arlen was shocked to find a receipt for surveillance equipment under the bed. In a video she posted on the social media platform, she shows the receipt, which lists over $1,000 worth of flash drives, audio recorders, and hidden cameras. There's even things on the receipt like pocket keychain audio recorder and power bank hidden camera. Cameras that look like normal everyday objects that are often provided in Airbnbs, like keychains for house keys and phone chargers. Arlen recently moved to the Houston area from Utah and has been staying at Airbnbs while she, her sister, and her boyfriend look for more permanent housing. In this particular instance, the apartment the trio originally rented looked a lot different in person than the photos online. And it was infested with cockroaches. Ew. They complained to the building owner, who then moved them to a different unit. The apartment they relocated to was cleaner and more on par with their living standards, and everything seemed to go fine for the most part until the last day of their month-long stay. While cleaning the place prior to their departure, the renters found the suspicious receipt for surveillance equipment. Based on the sheer amount of goods detailed on the slip, Arlen concluded that someone was intent on doing some heavy-duty spying. She reported the find to Airbnb, but said that they weren't very helpful and told her to contact the owner. Home-share programs like Airbnb can be a great thing for people seeking unique or low-budget accommodations. But stories like this remind us that it's important to use utmost caution when choosing a place to stay. Do you have any weird or strange Airbnb stories? Let me know in the comments below. A massacre in the backyard. 2 years ago, Vitaly Kvasha began digging in his yard in Siberia near the Chinese border, with plans to expand his home. He started finding bones, and not just a few of them. As the skeletal remains kept turning up, Kvasha put them in flour sacks and stacked them against his house. Over time, the homeowner found the bones of 60 people and counting when he spoke with the media in late 2019. Government experts who were dispatched to the site believe that the mass grave dates back to the 1930s, when the Stalinist regime imprisoned and massacred political rebels. He said that he was rushing to finish digging before winter arrived and the soil froze. He had just removed 3 bones from the ground and knew that there were probably more to come. Kvasha seemed more annoyed than shocked. By then, he was ready to get the job done and over with so that he could proceed with his home renovations. Joseph Stalin committed horrifying atrocities in his bid to squash any and all opposition. Anyone who dared to speak out against the Soviet dictator was forced into a system of remote labor camps called gulags. Many prisoners died from starvation, disease, exhaustion, and other effects of the brutal conditions, which came with 14-hour workdays in extreme weather and meager nourishment at best. Executions were also common at these hellish establishments. Many people think that the Russian government avoids facing the shameful historical chapter. Based on his experience with finding the bones, Kvasha thinks this is entirely possible. He repeatedly asked the authorities to help him dig up the dozens of human remains on his property, but they allegedly claimed that they didn't have the money and resources to assist with the task. They only agreed to pick up the bones after Kvasha finished digging them out. This is much different from what happens in many countries when people make archaeological discoveries. Not only are people required to report their findings to the authorities by law, they are often discouraged from continuing to dig. This is so that professionals can study the objects in their proper context and excavate them without damaging them. So it makes sense that the Russian government's apparent lack of interest in studying the bones seems like an attempt to hide from its dark past. And now for number 5. But first, I wanted to give a big shout out to Haley Landry and Ubaldo Myers, who are some of our longest supporters. Thank you so much for sticking around. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the Origins Explained family. Galactic medieval tombs. Archaeologists recently announced the discovery of over 10,000 medieval Islamic tombs in the Kassala region of eastern Sudan. A study suggests that the burials are arranged in obscure galactic patterns. Researchers noticed right away that the clustered burials made sense based on the environment, but wondered if there was a deeper meaning behind their placement. The team examined the tomb's layout using satellite imagery and a method called the Neyman-Scott cluster process, which was originally developed to study stars and galaxies' spatial patterns. It's the first time archaeologists decided to use this technique on Earth. They found that there were smaller clusters of burials surrounding several so-called parent tombs, reflecting the location's sacredness to the people who laid the deceased to rest there. Tombs were also found in greater numbers in places with more access to building materials and favorable topography. The burial grounds most likely belong to the semi-nomadic Beja people, who still live in the region today. Because very few of the tombs have been excavated, there is a lot more to uncover here. Maya canoe. Archaeologists working at the Chichen Itza Mayan ruins in southern Mexico have just discovered a wooden canoe thought to be over 1,000 years old. The nearly intact vessel was found outside the ancient city in a freshwater pool called a cenote. Perhaps you've been to one. During routine excavations ahead of the planned construction of a tourist train route. Measuring over 5 feet long and 2.5 feet wide, the boat may have been used for transporting water from the cenote or leaving ritual offerings at the site, according to a statement from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History. It's the first complete canoe of its kind ever found in the area. The next step is for experts to analyze the wood to determine its age. They believe that the canoe dates back to sometime between 830 and 950 AD. But until they perform reliable scientific tests, they can't say for sure. Scientists will also create a 3D model of the boat for further study, and so that replicas can be made. The Mayan civilization peaked during that time period, with dozens of cities established throughout modern-day southern Mexico and other parts of Central America, including Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. But the empire mysteriously collapsed toward the end of this golden age, most likely from a combination of warfare, drought, overpopulation, and who knows what else. Meteorite lands in woman's bed. British Columbia resident Ruth Hamilton was sound asleep in her bed recently when a meteorite crashed through her roof and landed next to her pillow The rock narrowly missed her head when it crashed just inches away, showering her with debris and awakening her with a loud bang. What are the odds? Hamilton jolted awake and rushed to turn her light on. She discovered the meteorite between the two pillows on her bed. It was roughly the size of a fist and weighed 2.8 pounds, according to the New York Times. Hamilton dialed 911, and the officer who reported to the scene determined that a local construction company had not set off any explosions nearby. Interestingly, a spokesperson mentioned seeing a bright light in the sky around the same time that the rock plunged through Hamilton's roof. He also said that the object exploded and caused several large booms. It was then that Hamilton put two and two together and realized that the rock came from space. Thousands of meteorites slam into the Earth every year, but most go unnoticed because they tend not to land near people. In fact, it's incredibly rare for one of these otherworldly objects to come into such close contact with someone. There are only a handful of recorded cases of this happening. One famous instance happened back in 1954, when a meteorite struck a woman named Anne Hodges while she slept in her Alabama home. The softball-sized chunk of space debris hit Hodges in the side, leaving a painful bruise. Hamilton realized she could have been seriously harmed and was left shaken by the close call, which struck at a time and place when a person expects to feel their safest, at home, in their bed, in the middle of the night. Do you have any good meteor stories? Let me know in the comments below. And now for number 4. But first, I wanted to give a big shout out to Joe Kinsarabia, who is a new subscriber. Welcome! If you are new here, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, because we have lots more videos about amazing discoveries coming up. Severed bear claw. During an early morning run in Black Mountain, North Carolina, a woman named Ashley Mooneyham spotted something unusual on the side of a busy road. She didn't know what it was at first glance and thought it might be part of someone's Halloween costume. But when she took a closer look, she realized that it was a severed bear paw. It was left next to a bag of salt that was presumably meant to preserve the body part. Sadly, this is an ongoing problem in the area. Jody Williams, who founded the nonprofit Help Asheville Bears, or HAB, told local news that 34 local bears have lost limbs due to illegal trapping. Bear hunting is legal at certain times of the year in North Carolina, but bear trapping is absolutely against the law. HAB is dedicated to combating poaching and the lucrative bear part trade. Williams said that paws and gallbladders are in especially high demand on the black market as natural remedies. For example, in China, a bowl of bear paw soup sells for as much as $1,000. Bears who lose limbs are at a huge disadvantage in the wilderness, obviously. They're initially at risk of infection, and even if they manage to heal, they are still faced with difficulties foraging for food. Their ability to defend themselves is compromised, and they face long-lasting medical problems. For those who are lucky to make it to old age, pain and arthritis can cause them to start walking upright or on their elbows. HAB is planning to open North Carolina's first bear rehabilitation center and is offering a reward of up to $10,000 for information about the cruel bear poaching and body part trade. Teotihuacan stone faces. The ancient city of Teotihuacan thrived in what is now central Mexico during the first half of the first millennium AD. Archaeologists have found hundreds of small stone faces among its ruins and believe that they were buried with the dead. Measuring just 6 to 9 inches wide, the ghoulish masks feature gaping mouths and big empty eyes that seem to stare blankly ahead. At one time, researchers thought that they were manufactured within the city and that they were made from jadeite. A 2014 study that examined 150 of the faces revealed that they were crafted at workshops far south of the city, although experts haven't pinpointed their exact origins. Their makers used limestone, serpentinite, travertine, and a rare volcanic rock called liswonite. The masks were polished with quartz, which isn't found near Teotihuacan, and helped tip experts off that they were made elsewhere. These findings proved that everything scholars previously wrote about the stone faces was untrue, according to anthropologist Jane Walsh. The masks and other artifacts found at Teotihuacan also reflect its far-reaching trade connections and vast wealth. The identity of the Rude Man. The Cerny Abyss Giant, also called the Rude Man, is a large artwork carved into the landscape on a hilltop in Dorset, England. Researchers have long wondered about the identity of the 180-foot geoglyph, which is equipped with a 35-foot phallus. The giant has long been a fertility icon, with legend claiming that a couple will have reproductive success if they do the deed on top of the geoglyph's crotch. But until recently, experts were unsure whether the artwork truly was a Bronze Age fertility symbol, or if it was perhaps a Roman depiction of Hercules, or even a parody of Oliver Cromwell, a 17th century politician who led armies against King Charles I during the English Civil War. Last year, scientists took samples from the giant's elbows and feet. They determined that he was created sometime between 700 and 1100 AD. It's the only chalk figure in the region that has been dated to the late Saxon or early medieval periods. This fascinating discovery leaves lingering questions about the rude man and the many other chalk geoglyphs found throughout southern England. Very little is known about the artwork, which includes a 360-foot-long horse, as well as war memorials, a giant kiwi bird, and more. The oldest geoglyph dates back around 3,000 years, and while over 30 survive, as many as 60 have disappeared over time. The reason for their creation is a mystery, yet people have carefully maintained many of the geoglyphs from one generation to the next, making sure that they don't grass over and become obscured. Since their original meaning is unknown, people have taken the liberty of making their own stories and assigning meaning to the colossal images over the centuries. What do you think was the purpose of these ancient glyphs? Fertility, giant graffiti, or some other purpose? Let me know in the comments below. Roman sculptures. While excavating an abandoned medieval church in Buckinghamshire, England recently, archaeologists unearthed a pair of complete Roman sculptures depicting a man and a woman. And this is just one of many incredible finds. In addition to the sculptures, the team uncovered a hexagonal glass Roman jug thought to be more than 1,000 years old. They've also removed around 3,000 skeletons from the site already. These extremely rare finds turned up at the old St. Mary's Church in Stoke Mandeville. Lead archaeologist Dr. Rachel Wood said that it would have been surprising enough to find even just a stone head or a set of shoulders, but that it was even more astonishing to find two statues with both their head and shoulders intact. She further explained that the discovery is helping experts better understand what the site was used for before the church was built in 1080. They believe that it also functioned as a Roman mausoleum. This place has been extremely important to people for thousands of years, so uncovering all of the layers of history will be quite the process. Ancient cave tombs. While excavating the ancient city of Blandos in modern-day Turkey, archaeologists recently discovered 400 rock-cut chamber tombs dating back some 1,800 years. Blandos was founded during the time of Alexander the Great and was still around throughout the Roman and Byzantine era. The tombs found there make up one of the world's largest rock-cut necropolises. Many of the burials contain numerous sarcophagi, indicating that families often reuse the same tomb for several generations. Archaeologist Beryl Khan explained that it was normal for a family to reopen a tomb each time they had to bury another family member. They performed a funeral ceremony while placing the deceased inside, then closed the tomb back up. Blandos was situated on a hill among a surrounding valley as part of one of the world's longest canyon systems. For this reason, it made the most sense to bury the dead in rock-cut tombs that were built into the canyon slopes. Archaeologists have known about Blandos for over a century and a half, but only began thoroughly excavating the site in 2018. In addition to the tombs, they have found a theater, 2 temples, a public bath, a gymnasium, aqueducts, city walls, and a gate. Khan mentioned that there are also several known religious, public, and civil structures underground. Sadly, many of the burials at Blandos were looted throughout history and now have lost many of the items of precious jewelry and other valuable artifacts they once held. Nevertheless, the team has found plenty of clues to learn about the site, including coins, pottery fragments, and paintings that cover the tomb's walls and ceilings. They plan to perform DNA tests on the human remains that they've recovered in hopes of learning about the individual's genders, ages, diets, and ancestry. An alarming X-ray. Earlier this year, Massachusetts resident Bradford Gauthier began experiencing throat dryness and trouble swallowing. He initially believed that the symptoms were side effects from the physically grueling task of shoveling snow the night before. But when he tried to take a sip of water, it wouldn't go down, leaving Gauthier with no choice but to spit it out into his kitchen sink. When he realized that the AirPod earphones he had been using the night before were missing and could only find one of them, The man's family began to wonder if he had somehow swallowed the other one in his sleep. Meanwhile, the pressure on Gautier's chest became too great to ignore, and he went to the emergency room. He later explained in a Facebook post that an X-ray revealed the missing AirPod in the lower part of his esophagus. Doctors performed an emergency endoscopy and were thankfully able to remove the earphone without incident. Gautier warned his social media followers to use caution when falling asleep with headphones in, and thanked his wife for putting her day on hold to take him to the hospital. Saint Anthony's tongue. Saint Anthony was a man of Portuguese descent who became a priest in Italy during the 13th century. He was sickly for much of his early priesthood and spent a lot of time in the hospital. But when his talent for speaking was discovered, he began traveling throughout Italy and France, delivering powerful sermons despite his health issues. The papal court praised the man's speeches, calling them the jewel of the Bible. Pope Gregory IX declared Anthony the Ark of the Testament. He was canonized shortly after he died from edema in 1231. 32 years later, plans were made to move St. Anthony's remains from their original resting place to a new basilica that was built in his honor. When his body was exhumed, his tongue was still intact. It was reportedly wet and glistening, despite the rest of his body having decomposed. This was seen as proof of St. Anthony's gift for words and for teaching the Word of God. His tongue, jaw, and forearm were removed and put on display at the Basilica of St. Anthony of Padua, where they remain today. The rest of his body was entombed in a nearby chapel. Imagine having parts of your body exhumed, preserved, and put on display. What do you think of this practice? Creepy or normal? Let me know in the comments below. Ancient fruit baskets. Once Egypt's largest port, the ancient city of Tanis Heraklion began disappearing during the 2nd century BC, when it partially sank below the waters of Abukir Bay near modern-day Alexandria. Tanis Heraklion was even further submerged during the 8th century AD, amid a series of natural disasters, including an earthquake and tidal waves. The city's ruins were rediscovered around 20 years ago by French marine archaeologist Frank Gaudio. Discoveries are still being made at the site, and researchers recently announced that they found hundreds of bronze and ceramic artifacts, as well as wicker baskets dating back to the 4th century BC. After laying untouched for over 2,000 years, the baskets were still filled with grape seeds and a palm fruit called doum, which the ancient Egyptians considered sacred. Gaudio believes that the baskets and fruit may have managed to survive because they were originally placed in an underground room, perhaps as part of a funeral or a burial rite. A burial mound and grave offerings found nearby make Gaudio's theory seem more likely. Evidence of a burning ritual at the site indicates that people were banned from going there, and that it was sealed for centuries before Tanis Heraklion was swallowed by the sea. Gaudio said that the site appears to have only been used once, but the reason why is a mystery. He hopes that the many artifacts found at the site will help answer this burning question. A bird that hunted koalas. Around 25 million years ago, Australia was home to an eagle-like raptor that fed on other birds, as well as possums and koalas. Equipped with long legs, widely spaced feet, and short, robust wings, it was adapted to hunting in the forest. Scientists unearthed the bird's fossilized skeleton in 2016 at Lake Pingpa in southern Australia. The salt lake dried up a long time ago, and the region is now a desert with a harsh, dry climate. But when the bird was alive, the area was a rainforest. The newly identified species, dubbed Archaeoherax sylvestris, is a surprising find. At the time of its existence, avian predators near the top of the food chain, like hawks and eagles, occurred in small numbers. Finding just one eagle bone from the period would be rare, according to a statement from paleontologist Dr. Trevor Worthy. Researcher Ellen Mather explained that A. sylvestris was the largest eagle in Australia during its time. With a 6-inch footspan, it was capable of swooping down and snatching up prey as big as a small dog. Like today's forest-dwelling eagles, it had short wings that enabled it to navigate in a habitat that was densely packed with trees. What do you think about birds snatching up koalas as a snack? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already to learn about more amazing discoveries. Conjoined turtles. Staff at a Massachusetts wildlife facility were recently surprised to witness the hatching of conjoined baby turtles with 2 heads and a fused body. The New England Wildlife Center's Cape Cod branch reported on Facebook that the diamondback terrapin pair were very alert and active just days after they emerged from the shell. The post pointed out that conjoined animal twins don't usually survive long or have a high quality of life. Case in point, earlier this year, vets performed surgery to separate a pair of conjoined yellow belly sliders at the Outer Banks Wildlife Shelter in Newport, North Carolina. Only one of them survived the operation. But the newly hatched turtles in Massachusetts are defying the odds, according to the Wildlife Center's Facebook post announcing their arrival into the world. Having 2 heads is an extremely rare condition known as bicephaly. Other known examples include a 2-headed viper that was found in Virginia, a dead 2-headed deer discovered in Minnesota, and a dead 2-headed porpoise that was removed from the North Sea. Living in a shed. Recently, during a routine inspection of a restaurant in southern England, employees of a public health organization found one of the business's employees living in a shed behind the establishment. He had been using cardboard as insulation, according to a spokesperson for the agency, who described the discovery as disturbing. The authorities saw to it that the shed was immediately taken down and reported that they were working with the unnamed restaurant's owner to improve the living conditions for workers who live on the property. While this discovery isn't necessarily scary, it's definitely a little depressing. Sadly, this isn't the first time a restaurant was caught housing employees in deplorable conditions. In late 2020, inspectors found 3 staff members living in the basement of the Dream Place, a Chinese restaurant in Palatine, Illinois. The village manager temporarily suspended the business's license after firefighters responded to an alarm and found beds and personal belongings downstairs. They also discovered a bucket full of urine and an unapproved shower consisting of a plastic tub, plastic sheeting, and a shower head attached to a hand sink. The conditions were both dangerous and extremely unsanitary, with storage items and furniture blocking access to the electric panels and garbage strewn throughout the establishment. An attorney for the building's owner argued that the restaurant had been financially impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, but a subsequent inspection also found several other code violations that hadn't been remedied. Discoveries like this will definitely make you stop and think twice about what might be going on behind closed doors at a business, especially places where you order food. Mutilated Stone Age skulls. In late 2020, archaeologists announced the discovery of 2 human skulls and the skeleton of a young goat at the Cueva de la Dehesilla cave site on the Iberian Peninsula. The bones date back to sometime between 4,800 and 4,000 BC, during the Middle Neolithic period of the Late Stone Age. They were found among structures and other artifacts from an ancient funerary ritual, including a stone altar, a hearth, ceramic pottery, stone objects, charred plant remains, and a stone slab called a stele. Both human skulls belong to adults, 1 male and 1 female. There is a depression in the frontal lobe of the woman's cranium, which also bears signs of decapitation and trepanation, a surgery that involved drilling a hole into the skull. The skulls and the goat skeleton were found on one side of a wall separating them from the altar and hearth. Researcher Daniel Garcia Rivero said that the differential treatment of the remains is a first among Neolithic funerary rites on the Iberian Peninsula. He further explained that the discovery is changing researchers' understandings of the death rituals that went on during one of the least understood Neolithic periods in the region. Early trigonometry. The ancient Greeks are widely credited with inventing the foundations of modern trigonometry, but a new discovery indicates that the Babylonians may have used it 1,500 years earlier. A new study describes how Australian mathematician Daniel F. Mansfield came to this conclusion by examining a series of strange numbers on an ancient clay tablet fragment known as Plimpton 322. Created in ancient Mesopotamia sometime between 1822 and 1762 BC, the artifact has long perplexed experts since its discovery. In 1945, researchers said that the tablet appears to contain evidence of a primitive form of trigonometry. Mansfield sought to prove his theory that this type of math was developed to accommodate the need to mark boundaries during the rise of private property. He found answers in Psi 427, a tablet that was made in modern-day Iraq between 1900 and 1600 BC. It describes the sale of a plot of land and contains extremely precise information about its boundaries. Coupled with Plimpton 322, it appears as though the Babylonians developed geometry for creating accurate perpendicular lines. Mansfield backed up his claims with support from cultural texts, including a description of a senior scribe scolding a junior scribe for calculating dimensions improperly. While Mansfield's hypothesis remains unproven, it presents a solid argument justifying more research into the possibility that the Babylonians came before the Greeks with their mathematical developments. World War II bunker in a Roman fort. One of Britain's best-preserved Roman forts can be found at the Alderney Nunnery in the Channel Islands. It was built in the 4th century and has passed through multiple hands. The property also functioned as a fort and barracks during medieval times, and the Germans used it during World War II. Its history is only now coming to light. Excavations began during the 1930s, but it wasn't until 2011 that archaeologists confirmed long-held suspicions that the fort dates back to Roman times. After 4 years of digging, they determined that it was built shortly before the empire collapsed. The Romans probably put the fort there during a time of panic, when they were scrambling to protect their territory against invaders. Even nearly 1,500 years after it was built, the site was ideal for military use, thanks to its 10-foot-thick walls. The Germans evicted the entire population when they took control of the island in 1940. Then they built fortifications, bunkers, tunnels, and 2 forced labor and concentration camps. Archaeologists are still excavating the site, where they recently unearthed a series of buildings, drains, and other features that the Nazis implemented after they occupied the island. Evidence shows that the Germans installed a bunker precisely within the walls of the Roman fort. Interestingly, they left one area alone completely. Known as the sunroom, it may hold important clues about what happened to the site after the Roman Empire collapsed. The findings are causing experts to wonder if there ever was a convent on the property like they've long believed. It'll take them some time to figure it out as they continue to disentangle the history behind the jumbled mess of artifacts and buildings spanning nearly 2,000 years. Medieval beard comb. More than 1,500 years ago in what is now Bavaria, Germany, a wealthy medieval man between the ages of 40 and 50 years old passed away. He was buried with a horse and fine weapons, indicating that he may have been a fierce warrior. But the man's grave also contained luxury items, including a pair of scissors and an ivory comb that experts believe he may have used to groom his beard. The comb bears images of gazelle-like animals fleeing predators. It's noticeably more ornate than most combs found in graves from the Middle Ages, pointing toward the man's high-ranking social status. Nearby, the team found an equally extravagant burial belonging to a woman. Her grave contained jewelry, food, and a red ceramic bowl that researchers believe was imported from North Africa. The man and woman both passed away sometime during the 6th century, according to a statement from the Bavarian State Office for Monument Protection, which oversaw the excavations. Several of the grave goods are unusual for the period, especially the comb and the ceramic bowl. The pair lived in a region of Germany known as the Rice Crater. Measuring 16 miles in diameter, the area was carved out by an ancient meteor. NASA reported that it's difficult to detect in satellite images due to its subtle shape and low elevation, which help it blend in with its surroundings. In fact, the pair may not have even known they were living in an ancient crater, even though their settlement follows its faint outline. Dying dolphins. A group of bottlenose dolphins living in the mouth of the Port River in the city of Adelaide, Australia, are one of the few populations of the species that can be found in an urban environment. The river is part of the Adelaide Dolphin Sanctuary, or ADS, which is supposed to be a safe place for the animals. But for some reason, the dolphins keep turning up dead or missing, and authorities have yet to figure out why. In August, a 12-year-old male dolphin named Tallulah was found dead. He was famous among locals for walking across the water's surface on his tail. Tallulah had started to show signs of emaciation and poor skin health in the days leading up to his death. Around the same time, 2 of Tallulah's friends, Twinkle and Doc, went missing and were presumed dead after they began showing similar symptoms. All 3 of the dolphins had started scavenging for food and eating discarded fish scraps, which concerned specialists. Environment and Water Minister David Spears ordered an investigation into the dolphins' failing health and alarming population decline. At one time, there were over 40 Port River dolphins. Now, sadly, there is only around 10 left. Over the past 4 years, only 3 calves have survived. Meanwhile, 10 calves and 8 adult females have died, according to ADS researcher Mariana Borman, who spoke with ABC Australia. She explained that while the dolphins are under the constant threat of shark attacks, boat strikes, and fishing line entanglements, the cause behind the uptick in deaths is unknown. She suspects that pollution or a virus could be to blame. Sadly, if an illness is the culprit, Borman said there is not much that can be done to help the sick creatures. Ofuka Cho mass grave. Last year, archaeologists excavated a series of strange circular holes containing the remains of 1,500 people and animals at the Ofuka Cho site in Osaka, Japan. Dating back to the mid to late 19th century, during Japan's Edo period, the bizarre burials contain humans, pigs, horses, and at least 1 cat. Officials discovered the graves near a busy train station during the construction of a new skyscraper. There were no grave goods at the site, leading experts to believe that the people buried there couldn't afford nicer tombs. Some of the remains bear signs of disease, so it's also possible that the individuals perished during an epidemic that swept through the area during the 1800s. In addition to finding holes crammed with bones, the team unearthed coffins filled with several bodies each. This further suggests that the graves contain the victims of a deadly disease. City officials said that the burials likely belonged to young people and children from the local area, which was a farming region when they died. It was the first discovery of a historical cemetery in Osaka, and its contents provide insight into the past burial customs of ordinary people. Scientists are studying the remains in an attempt to learn more about what killed the grave's occupants. Neanderthal cave art. We tend to think of Neanderthals as extremely primitive and unintelligent, but a growing number of discoveries in recent years points toward the opposite. Take, for example, new research concluding that Neanderthals created cave art. The study focuses on red ochre pigment found on stalactites in a Spanish cave, which scientists concluded did not end up there naturally. Instead, Neanderthals used methods called spattering and blowing to apply the pigment to the stalactites around 60,000 years ago. The findings come on the heels of a 2018 study claiming that Neanderthals painted cave walls in Spain as far back as 65,000 years ago, before humans supposedly inhabited Europe. But the study was controversial, especially because another paper asserted that the red ochre could have gotten onto the cave walls naturally. The new research delved further into the topic and found that the markings are consistent with man-made activities, adding to the realization that our prehistoric cousins were smarter and more talented than we've historically given them credit for. It seems that they, like us, also like to personalize their interiors. Ancient pottery lessons. Fingerprints that were left behind on a 5,000-year-old clay pottery fragment suggest that ancient people enjoyed taking arts and crafts lessons, just like we do today. The artifact bears the fingerprints of a 13-year-old boy and 2 adult men, indicating that more experienced potters taught beginners how to sculpt clay. The evidence was found at a complex of ancient buildings in Scotland's Orkney Islands. Ceramic specialists noticed the fingerprints while examining the site's vast collection of pottery shards. By analyzing the prints, experts were able to pinpoint the age and gender of the people they belonged to. The findings suggest that at least 1 and possibly 2 teenage boys worked under the watchful eye of 2 men, who were around 19 years old. Only 8 fingerprints have been found among the thousands of pottery fragments collected at the site. Similar evidence of pottery lessons that was found on Bronze Age vessels from the Levant shows that numerous cultures took a hands-on approach to teaching the craft, which I guess isn't very surprising. After all, what better way to learn than from the guidance of a seasoned pro? Coldest lab temperature ever recorded. Scientists in Germany have achieved the coldest lab temperature ever recorded, measuring out to 38 trillionths of a degree above minus 273.15 Celsius. They accomplished this while investigating the quantum properties of an alleged fifth state of matter called the Bose-Einstein condensate, or the Beck. In simple terms, this is a gas derivative that only exists under ultra-cold conditions. Matter starts to behave like one large atom while in the Beck phase. Scientists have determined that temperature measures molecular vibration. In other words, the more a collection of molecules moves, the higher the temperature. All molecular motion stops at absolute zero on the Kelvin scale, which is the equivalent of minus 459.67 degrees Fahrenheit, or minus 273.15 degrees Celsius. When matter nears absolute zero, it takes on strange forms that we're not used to. For example, one study found that light becomes a pourable liquid. During the recent record-breaking experiment, the team trapped roughly 100,000 rubidium atoms within a magnetic field inside of a vacuum chamber. They then cooled the temperature to 2 billionths of a degree Celsius above absolute zero, which was actually a record-setting temperature on its own. But the team took things a step further and cooled the gas even more. Doing so required imitating deep space conditions, so they went to the European Space Agency's drop tower in northern Germany. While there, the researchers dropped the vacuum chamber and rapidly switched the magnetic field on and off while it free fell. This enabled the Beck to float and ground its molecular action almost to a complete stop. During that time, it reached the new record low temperature and held it for 2 seconds. The team estimated that they would be able to hold this frigid temperature for as long as 17 seconds in truly weightless condition. The severed head of Saint Catherine of Siena. Saint Catherine of Siena lived during the 14th century in Siena, Italy. She began having religious visions at just 7 years old, when she saw Jesus on a throne surrounded by saints. When she was a teen, she vowed to remain a virgin for life and devoted herself entirely to prayer and worship. Her family ignored her wishes and tried to marry her off, so she cut off her hair and became a nun. Catherine experienced the stigmata at age 28 while praying at a crucifix. 5 red rays shot out of it, piercing her hands, feet, and heart. People saw her levitating during prayer, and one priest claimed that the Holy Communion flew out of his hand and into her mouth. Catherine died in Rome when she was just 33 years old after having a stroke that paralyzed her from the waist down. The people of her hometown wanted her body, but knew they wouldn't be able to sneak it past the Roman guards. So they removed her head and put it in a paper bag, hoping they could slip by without raising suspicion. But the guards stopped them. The thieves prayed to Catherine to protect them, and when the guards looked into the bag, all they saw were rose petals. The head had rematerialized by the time the townspeople made it back to Siena. This is considered Catherine's final miracle. Today, her head sits in a reliquary in the Basilica San Domenico, and her thumb is kept nearby. Catherine's foot is rumored to be somewhere in Venice, and the rest of her body is in Rome. Tikal Monument. Archaeologists are increasingly discovering sites that are buried in the earth and hidden beneath thick foliage, thanks to advanced laser scanning technology known as LiDAR. Earlier this year, a team identified a human-made structure buried and concealed by a hill in the ancient Maya city-state of Tikal, located in modern-day Guatemala. The structure turned out to be a pyramid that was part of an ancient neighborhood filled with buildings much different from the rest of Tikal. Their shape, orientation, and other architectural features more closely resemble the structures found in the ancient city of Teotihuacan, which is located over 800 miles to the west in what is now Mexico City. A closer look at the site revealed what appears to be a replica of the citadel, a massive square in Teotihuacan. It was recreated in stunning detail, according to researchers. The fact that such a groundbreaking discovery was made at Tikal, one of the world's most extensively excavated sites, shows just how useful LiDAR is when it comes to finding undetected archaeological gems in places where satellite imagery usually fails, including in the thick Central American jungle. The next question for researchers to answer is why a monument resembling Teotihuacan's citadel was implemented in Tikal. One possibility is that cosmopolitan cities of the past were melting pots, just like they are today, according to geographer Thomas Garrison. In other words, people of different cultural backgrounds, customs, and languages gathered at the site to engage in rituals that express shared values while retaining their separate backgrounds. Imperial Roman tiles. Archaeologists recently began excavating a 3rd century Roman bathhouse at the Carlisle Cricket Club in England. They have already turned up numerous fascinating artifacts, including pottery and a ring. But the most exciting find so far is a collection of floor tiles bearing an imperial stamp, indicating that the site had close ties with a Roman emperor. Lead archaeologist Frank Giecco told the press that the Roman legions and auxiliaries were known for stamping their floor tiles, but the ones found at the site were at the top of the pile. In other words, they bear the mark of the imperial court, the emperor and his people. The tiles date back to the rule of Septimius Severus, a wealthy man from Africa who seized power in 193 AD. He ruled until 211, when he fell ill and died in the city of Eboracum, known today as York. Although nobody can say for sure whether Severus visited the bathhouse in Carlisle, it's known that he was in Britain at the time. In addition to finding his signature tiles, the archaeological team identified an inscription from the ruler's wife on the building. All signs point towards Severus at least passing through the area at one point or another. Reopened graves. Roughly 1,400 years ago, people living in Europe developed an apparent habit of reopening burials and retrieving grave goods for reasons that experts have yet to determine. In a new study, scientists examined 5 regions throughout the continent where this was known to happen. They found that between the 6th and 8th centuries, people dug up graves and took items that don't seem to be targets in typical grave robberies. Women's brooches and men's swords were among the top choices for objects that were removed from burials. Meanwhile, people left valuable items in the graves, including things made from precious metals like silver and gold. What's even more perplexing is that the objects taken from graves were often in poor condition, with little to no practical or economic value, according to the team. People usually dug up graves within a generation of a deceased individual's burial. In the researchers' words, the most frequent time frame for reopening was after soft tissue decay, but before any wooden container had collapsed or become filled with sediment. It takes just a few years for a body to reach this level of decomposition. Experts propose that people had different reasons for doing this, and that their motivations varied from one place to the next depending on local concerns and understandings of death and funerary rites. The objects that people took may have had symbolic value, especially considering how swords and brooches were passed down through families as heirlooms. Whatever the reason, the tradition of reopening graves was short-lived. After peaking during the 7th century, the custom waned pretty quickly. Not all researchers agree with the study's conclusion that the grave goods had symbolic significance, or with the determination that burials were reopened within a few years. Because bodies and caskets decompose at different rates depending on the environment, it's hard to say how long after someone's death their family dug up their grave. This was actually the first study that examined the tradition of grave opening throughout Europe as a whole, rather than from a location-specific perspective like a small town, making the research valuable in its own right. Industrial winery. Around 1,500 years ago during the Byzantine era, an industrial winery was built south of Tel Aviv in Yavne, Israel. Using sophisticated equipment, it produced around 2 million liters of wine every year and exported it throughout the Mediterranean. Archaeologists who recently discovered the site were taken aback by its size. The team found 5 wine presses spread throughout a 1-kilometer squared area, kilns that were used for firing wine jars, and warehouses where the wine was stored and bottled. The product was called Gaza and Ashkelon wine after the ports, where it was loaded onto ships and exported to Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Excavation director John Seligman told the BBC that the wine was known for its quality. In addition to being a recreational drink, it was a source of nutrition for many people, as well as an alternative to drinking water, which was often contaminated. Another ancient industrial-scale winery was recently discovered in northern Iraq. Dating back 2,700 years to the time of the Assyrian kings, the facility consists of 14 installations that were used to press grapes, extract juice, and ferment it into wine. These discoveries show that our appreciation for wine is timeless, and that some things never go out of style. Thanks for watching! What was your favorite discovery? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. We have lots more videos coming up. See you soon! Bye!